Nobody noticed the quiet woman in seat 23B. She wore old clothes and carried a cheap bag. Then the plane lost radio contact. Two F-22 fighter jets scrambled to intercept. When they discovered her identity, the pilots froze in shock. The legend they worshipped had been sitting in economy class all along. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun painted the sky orange as passengers filled Gate 12 at Denver Airport. Among them walked a woman who nobody noticed. She wore old jeans and a gray sweater with small holes in it. Her bag was cheap and worn. Her shoes were old hiking boots. She looked like someone's aunt going to visit family. Sarah Mitchell was her name on the ticket. She stood in line with everyone else. The gate agent barely looked at her boarding pass before waving her through. Sarah walked down the narrow airplane aisle. Other passengers pushed past her, rushing to claim overhead space for their expensive luggage. Her seat was 23B. The middle seat. The worst seat on any plane. On her left sat a businessman in an expensive suit. He was already typing on his laptop. On her right, a young mother struggled with a crying baby and too many bags. Sarah put her old duffel bag in the overhead bin. She sat down and pulled out a paperback book. The kind you buy at grocery stores for $3. The businessman glanced at her once, then returned to his work. She was nobody important to him. The flight attendant came by with a bright smile. "Can I help you find anything, ma'am?" Her voice was polite but carried a hint of pity. This woman in worn clothes was clearly not a frequent flyer. "No, thank you," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was soft and ordinary. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines roared to life. They rolled toward the runway. The baby next to Sarah started crying louder. The mother looked embarrassed and tired. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small stuffed bear. "Would this help?" she asked gently. "My nephew loved this one." The mother took it gratefully. "Thank you so much. That's very kind." She looked at Sarah and made quick assumptions. This woman probably worked with children. Maybe a daycare worker or a nanny. Someone simple and kind but not particularly accomplished. The mother smiled and turned her attention back to her baby. Behind them, two men in expensive suits talked loudly. They worked for a defense company. Their conversation carried over the seats. The F-22 program was a complete waste, one man said confidently. Too expensive, too complicated. Those planes barely see any action. Give me the old F-15s any day. His friend agreed. Exactly right. I've been saying that for years. The whole stealth fighter concept is overrated. They continued discussing military jets with absolute certainty. Neither man had ever been in a fighter jet. All their knowledge came from business meetings and reports. Sarah never looked up from her book. But the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. She turned a page with steady hands. Hands that showed no jewelry or painted nails. Just the rough calluses of someone who worked with their hands. The plane lifted off smoothly. Sarah felt the wheels leave the ground. Something in her posture relaxed. She was home in a way most people would never understand. Being in the air felt right to her. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah closed her book. She looked out the small window at the clouds below. The businessman next to her was still working. The baby had fallen asleep. Everything seemed normal and boring. But 300 miles away, something was wrong. At NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs, radar operators stared at their screens with growing concern. A civilian aircraft had stopped responding to radio calls. Its transponder was acting strange. The plane was heading toward restricted military airspace. "We've tried every frequency," one operator said. No response. "How long?" his supervisor asked. 8 minutes of silence. We need to scramble fighters. The alarm sounded at Whiteman Air Force Base. Major Jack Morrison was playing cards in the alert facility when the klaxon blared. He and his wingman, Captain Lisa Chen, both jumped to their feet. They were already wearing flight suits. Unknown aircraft, possible hijacking, the briefing officer said quickly. Intercept and identify. Within 90 seconds, both pilots were strapping into their F-22 Raptors. These were the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Nearly invisible to radar. Faster than sound. Armed with missiles and guns. Morrison had been flying F-22s for 6 years. He was one of the best pilots in the Air Force. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different countries. He wore the patch of an elite squadron that never lost in training exercises. "Razor, Viper, you're cleared for immediate takeoff," the tower controller said. "Vector 090, climb to flight level 400. "Razor copies," Morrison replied. He pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines roared. The F-22 rolled down the taxiway. 3 minutes after the alarm, both Raptors were in the air. Their afterburners left white trails across the blue sky. They were going supersonic, racing toward an unknown threat. On the commercial plane, passengers had no idea that 2 fighter jets were coming for them. Sarah sat quietly, looking out the window. The businessman next to her finally closed his laptop. He pulled out a report and began reading it with a gold pen. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes was stressed. He had 30 years of flying experience. Over 20,000 flight hours. But he'd never seen anything like this. "The radio is completely dead," he told his co-pilot, Jennifer Martinez. "Backup system isn't working either. The transponder is showing error codes I've never seen." "Try the emergency frequency again," Hayes said. Martinez pressed the microphone button. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. United Flight 227 experiencing complete communication failure. Requesting assistance." Only static answered. Their radio could transmit but couldn't receive. They were broadcasting into emptiness. Morrison reached altitude and contacted the AWACS command plane. "Huntress, Razor Flight of 2 checking in." "Razor, Huntress has you on radar," the controller replied. "Your target is United 227, Boeing 757. No radio contact. Course 030. Altitude 37,000. Intercept and identify." Morrison's blood ran cold. The authentication code meant this was potentially hostile. He might need to use his weapons. "Razor copies. Proceeding to intercept." He checked his weapons systems. Everything was armed and ready. Air-to-air missiles. A cannon with 480 rounds. He hoped desperately he wouldn't need any of it. "Tally target," Captain Chen called out. She'd spotted the plane. Morrison saw it too. A glint of sunlight on metal. The 2 F-22s accelerated and closed the distance. They rose up alongside the Boeing 757, positioning themselves where the cockpit crew could see them clearly. Captain Hayes saw movement in his peripheral vision. He turned and nearly had a heart attack. An F-22 Raptor was flying 50 feet from his window. So close he could see the pilot's helmet. He could see the weapons bays on the fighter's belly. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered. Martinez saw the fighter too. Her face went pale. Fighter jets intercepting a civilian plane meant one thing. Someone on the ground thought they were a threat. Morrison stabilized in formation. He could see the airline captain's shocked face. Morrison raised his hand and made the universal signal for radio failure. He pointed to his helmet and made a cutting motion across his throat. Hayes nodded vigorously. He understood. They had a radio problem and the military had scrambled fighters to investigate. "Huntress, Razor has visual contact," Morrison transmitted. Cockpit crew appears responsive. Aircraft under control. No visible damage. No apparent hostile action. On the plane, passengers on the left side started noticing the fighter. "Mom, there's a jet outside," a teenage boy shouted. His voice carried through the cabin. Suddenly everyone was trying to look. Voices rose in excitement and fear. The woman in 23B didn't need to look. She'd felt the subtle pressure change when the F-22 took formation. She recognized the shadow that crossed her window. She knew exactly what was happening. Her expression didn't change. But her hands tightened slightly on the armrests. Her mind began running through tactical assessments automatically. Years of training never really left you. The businessman leaned across her to look out the window. His expensive cologne washed over her as he invaded her space without asking. "Holy shit," he muttered. "That's an F-22. Why would they?" His voice trailed off as he understood. "Oh God, do they think we're hijacked?" The cabin erupted in controlled panic. Passengers pulled out phones to take pictures. Parents grabbed their children. The two defense contractors who'd been criticizing fighter jets earlier were now silent, pressing their faces to windows. The lead flight attendant called the cockpit on the interphone. "Captain, passengers are reporting military aircraft." "What's happening?" Hayes replied as calmly as he could. "Patricia, we have complete radio failure. The fighters are here following standard protocols. Keep everyone calm. This is just a safety precaution." He hoped he was telling the truth. Morrison pulled out his kneeboard. He wrote in large letters, "Follow me to nearest airport." He held the card up to his canopy where Hayes could see it clearly. Then he pointed forward. Hayes nodded. He understood. Without radios, the fighter would guide them to an emergency landing. He had no choice but to comply. "Huntress, Razor has established visual communication," Morrison reported. "Target is complying with diversion instructions. Request nearest suitable airport." "Razor, divert to Wichita Eisenhower," the controller replied. "Runway 19er left. Emergency services standing by." Morrison waggled his wings to get Hayes's attention. He began a gentle turn toward Wichita. The 757 followed. Captain Chen maintained position on the opposite wing. 3 aircraft were now locked together in an emergency that required perfect coordination. In the cabin, passengers watched the ground rising to meet them. The city of Wichita grew larger through the windows. Sarah remained calm. Her breathing was steady and controlled. She'd been in far more dangerous situations than this. She'd flown missions where enemy fighters were actively trying to kill her. She'd made emergency landings in aircraft so damaged they shouldn't have stayed in the air. This was serious, but it was manageable. She trusted the pilots knew their jobs. The teenager who first spotted the fighters was filming everything on his phone. "We're being escorted by F-22s. This is insane." Morrison guided the 757 through the approach using hand signals. On the ground at Wichita, every emergency vehicle was positioned along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, and FBI agents. The airport had been cleared. All other traffic diverted. No one knew if this was a simple radio failure or something more dangerous. Captain Hayes flew the approach manually. Every bit of his experience focused on making this landing perfect. The 757 descended on a smooth glide path. The F-22 stayed in formation until the last moment, then peeled away in a beautiful climbing turn. The airliner's wheels touched concrete smoothly. Hayes deployed the brakes and thrust reversers. The plane slowed and rolled toward a remote parking area away from the terminal. As the aircraft stopped, emergency vehicles surrounded it. Hayes shut down the engines. He looked at Martinez. They shared a moment of pure relief. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced over the speaker system. We've landed safely in Wichita due to a communications failure. Emergency services are here as standard protocol. Please remain seated and calm. Morrison and Chen climbed back to altitude, circling overhead. Razor, Huntress, good intercept, the controller said. Stand by for further instructions. Morrison felt his adrenaline fading. It had been a textbook intercept. Exactly the kind that prevented disasters. Even if this case seemed like just a mechanical problem. On the ground, FBI agents boarded the plane. The lead agent was Special Agent Marcus Holloway. He stood at the front of the cabin and addressed everyone. I'm Special Agent Holloway with the FBI. I know this has been frightening. We'll be conducting brief interviews with each of you. Please have your identification ready. The process began methodically. Agents worked through the cabin row by row. Most interviews took less than 5 minutes. Passengers showed IDs, answered a few questions, and that was it. Sarah waited patiently as agents worked backward through the cabin. When Holloway reached row 23, he barely glanced at her. He finished with the businessmen first. Then he turned to Sarah with the same routine efficiency. ID please, ma'am. She reached into her worn bag and pulled out her wallet. She handed him what looked like a standard driver's license. Holloway glanced down at it casually. Then he froze. His eyes went wide. He looked up at her face, then back at the ID, then at her face again. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Ma'am, he finally managed. His voice had completely changed. It carried profound respect that made nearby passengers turn to look. Ma'am, could you wait here please? Just one moment. He backed away, still staring at her. He moved quickly to the front of the cabin where he pulled his supervisor aside. They had a brief, intense conversation. Holloway showed her the ID. Her reaction was identical. Shock, disbelief, then something like awe. She pulled out her phone and made a quick call. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When she hung up, she stood for a moment, collecting herself. Then she walked back down the aisle. Sarah watched them approach with the same calm expression. Ma'am, the supervisor said carefully. Would you come with us to a private area? We'd like to discuss the situation with you. Of course, Sarah replied quietly. She stood with easy grace and picked up her duffel bag. The businessman and the young mother were both staring now. Whatever was on that ID had completely changed how the FBI agents treated this simple woman. They led her to a private room in the terminal. Inside were representatives from multiple agencies. FBI, TSA, FAA, and a military officer from Whiteman Air Force Base. The supervisor handed the ID to the military officer, a lieutenant colonel named David Chen. He took one look and immediately stood at attention. Colonel, he said, addressing Sarah directly. Colonel, I had no idea you were aboard that aircraft. She raised a hand gently. No apology necessary, Colonel. The response was appropriate and professional. Special Agent Holloway looked confused. I need to understand what's happening. The ID says her name is Colonel Sarah Mitchell. But that can't be right because... Lieutenant Colonel Chen interrupted. That's her legal name. But in the Air Force, she was known by her call sign. He paused. Ghost. The room went silent. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Chen continued, was the first woman to qualify on the F-22 Raptor. She flew more combat missions in the Raptor than any pilot alive. She commanded the 27th Fighter Squadron. She has 9 confirmed aerial victories, making her the first American female fighter ace since World War II. Most of those victories remain classified. Holloway's mouth fell open. The other agents stared in disbelief. Sarah simply shrugged. I was good at my job. The F-22 is an exceptional aircraft. Chen was checking his tablet. Colonel, the F-22 pilots who intercepted your flight are still on station. Major Jack Morrison and Captain Lisa Chin. With your permission, I'd like to inform them who was aboard. Sarah considered for a moment. Go ahead. Keep it professional. Chen picked up a radio. Huntress, Whiteman liaison requesting patch to Razor flight for priority communication. Morrison, still circling overhead, responded immediately. Huntress, Razor, send traffic. Razor, Whiteman liaison, Chen transmitted. We've identified a special passenger who was aboard United 227. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired. Call sign Ghost. I'm transmitting her service photo now. There was absolute silence on the radio frequency. Morrison's hands froze on his controls. Next to him, Captain Chen's F-22 wobbled slightly as she jerked in surprise. Their displays showed a photograph. A woman in a flight suit standing in front of an F-22. Helmet under her arm. Confident and professional. The name tape read, Mitchell. Say again, Morrison finally managed. His voice was tight with disbelief. Razor, you just intercepted an aircraft carrying Colonel Sarah Mitchell. Ghost. She was traveling as a civilian passenger. Morrison felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Every fighter pilot in the Air Force knew that call sign. Ghost was a legend. Stories about her were told everywhere. The mission over Syria where she shot down 2 enemy jets in one engagement. The training exercise where she defeated an entire squadron without them ever detecting her. The classified operations that people only whispered about. Jesus, Captain Chen breathed. We just intercepted Ghost. Morrison's mind was reeling. He'd joined the F-22 program years after Mitchell retired. But her influence was everywhere. Her tactics were still being taught. Her combat reports were still required reading. Her name was spoken with reverence. Whiteman liaison, Razor, Morrison transmitted. His voice was steadier now. Is Colonel Mitchell available for communication? In the command center, Chen looked at Sarah questioningly. She hesitated, then nodded. She accepted the radio handset. Razor flight, this is Ghost, she said. Her voice carried natural authority. Using her old call sign felt strange after years of retirement, but also right. Morrison felt a chill. That voice belonged to someone who had done things in an F-22 that he could only aspire to. Ghost, Razor. Ma'am, we had no idea. The intercept was perfect, Major, Sarah interrupted gently. Textbook procedures. Professional execution. Exactly what the situation required. You and Captain Chen did outstanding work. Captain Chen came on the frequency. Her voice carried excitement. Ma'am, I've read all your after-action reports that aren't classified. You're the reason I wanted to fly Raptors. Sarah smiled. Then you've made me proud, Captain. Keep up the good work. Maybe someday someone will say the same thing about you. Morrison spoke again. His voice carried profound respect. Ghost, Razor. It was an honor to share the sky with you today. If you're ever around Whiteman, we'd be honored to host you. I'll keep that in mind, Razor. Safe flying. Sarah handed the radio back to Chen. For a moment, she'd been Ghost again. Speaking the language of fighter pilots. Inhabiting that world she'd left behind. Back on the plane, word was spreading. The businessman from 23A was talking rapidly to anyone who would listen. She was right next to me. I had no idea. Do you know what she's done? The defense contractors who'd been criticizing the F-22 looked physically ill. One of the most accomplished F-22 pilots had been sitting behind them, listening to their ignorant commentary in complete silence. The young mother held her baby and the stuffed bear Sarah had given them. She suddenly understood that simple kindness had come from someone extraordinary who never felt the need to mention it. News spread fast. Within an hour, the story was trending on social media. Journalists were rushing to Wichita. The Pentagon was preparing statements. Sarah slipped out a side door. She declined interviews, avoided cameras, and made her way to a rental car counter with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all day. At Whiteman Air Force Base, Morrison and Chen landed and walked toward the debrief room in silence. "Did that actually happen?" Morrison finally said. "Did we really intercept Ghost?" Chen laughed and shook her head. "We did." And she complimented our flying. Their commander listened to their account with growing amazement. "You understand you just escorted one of the finest tactical minds in fighter aviation history." Colonel Mitchell literally wrote portions of the F-22 manual you both studied. Morrison nodded. "Sir, she was traveling in economy. Middle seat. Looking like nobody would notice." The commander smiled. "That's who she is, Razor. True professionals don't advertise. They just do the work. The measure of a pilot isn't the medals. It's the mission and knowing you served with honor." The story spread through fighter squadrons everywhere. The day 2 F-22 pilots intercepted a legend who needed no protection. Who remained dignified and gracious while passengers made assumptions based only on her appearance. It became a lesson about not judging people superficially. About the importance of humility. About how excellence often comes in unexpected packages. For Sarah Mitchell, it was a brief interruption in a retirement she'd earned through 20 years of service. She eventually made it to Washington, D.C. for her original plans. A reunion with old squadron mates. When she walked into the restaurant, a dozen retired fighter pilots stood as one. Their applause was spontaneous and heartfelt. These were people who knew her worth. Who'd flown with her. Who understood what she'd accomplished. "I hear you had an interesting flight," one said with a grin. Sarah laughed and accepted a glass of wine. "It was educational. Reminded me why I loved flying with professionals. Those kids in the Raptors did excellent work." Surrounded by friends who knew her as a colleague, Sarah was exactly where she belonged. Not in the spotlight. Not seeking recognition. But among her tribe. The warriors who spoke a common language forged in speed and altitude and trust earned through shared danger. Weeks later, the 442nd Fighter Wing formally invited Sarah to visit Whiteman Air Force Base. She eventually accepted. Walking through the squadron ready room felt like stepping back in time. The familiar sound surrounded her. The crackle of radios. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. The constant background noise of aircraft operations. Young pilots looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Unsure how to approach someone whose reputation preceded her so dramatically. Morrison and Chen gave her a tour of their aircraft. Sarah climbed the ladder into an F-22 cockpit for the first time in years. The familiar layout greeted her like an old friend. Multifunction displays. Helmet-mounted systems. Throttle and stick with their dozens of switches and buttons that she could have operated blindfolded even after years away. Her hands moved to the controls automatically. Muscle memory from thousands of hours reasserting itself instantly. She ran her fingers over the throttle quadrant. Feeling the texture of the grips. The placement of each switch exactly where her training had embedded them in her consciousness. "Feels like home, doesn't it?" Chen asked quietly, watching Sarah's face as she reacquainted herself with the aircraft. Sarah smiled, but there was sadness mixed with the joy. "It does. But this is your aircraft now, Captain. Yours and every other pilot in the current generation. My time in this seat is done. What matters now is that you take what we learned and push even further." She climbed down from the cockpit. The squadron commander approached with a package wrapped in simple brown paper. "Colonel, the squadron wanted to present you with something," he said, genuine warmth in his voice. "We took the liberty of having this made." Sarah unwrapped the package to find a custom flight suit. Her name, tape and rank precisely placed. But with one meaningful addition. A squadron patch for the 442nd Fighter Wing. And below it, a simple tab that read, Honorary Member. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. This meant more than any medal or formal recognition. This was acceptance from her tribe. Acknowledgement from the people who truly understood what she'd accomplished and what it had cost. I'm honored, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Truly honored. This means everything. The visit concluded with an informal gathering in the squadron bar where pilots traded stories and asked questions. A young first lieutenant fresh from the F-22 training pipeline worked up the courage to approach her. Ma'am, he said hesitantly. Everyone talks about your missions. But what I really want to know is, how did you handle the doubt? The people who said you didn't belong. Sarah studied him for a moment. Recognizing something in his uncertainty. You want the truth, Lieutenant? I doubted myself every single day. Even after hundreds of missions. Even after command. But I learned that doubt can be useful if you channel it correctly. It keeps you humble. Keeps you training. Keeps you sharp. The key is not letting it paralyze you. Use it as fuel to prepare better. To study harder. To refine your skills until you've earned your own confidence through performance, not arrogance. She paused, taking a sip of water. As for the people who doubted me because of my gender, I made a choice early on. I could spend my energy fighting every skeptic with words, or I could let my flying do the talking. Excellence is the only answer that truly silences doubt. Not anger. Not demands for respect. Just consistent, undeniable excellence. Be so good at your job that the doubters are forced to confront their own prejudices through your performance. The young lieutenant nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Around them, other pilots had fallen silent, listening. These weren't just lessons about gender barriers. They were lessons about professionalism. About handling pressure. About maintaining standards in an unforgiving profession that applied to anyone trying to excel. Morrison stood nearby, watching the interaction. He found himself reflecting on his own assumptions. He'd grown up in an air force where women in fighters were already established. But he realized now how much of that normalcy was built on the foundation Sarah and others like her had laid through sheer force of competence and character. They'd absorbed the doubt, the skepticism, the extra scrutiny. And they'd answered with performance that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. As evening approached and the gathering wound down, Morrison walked Sarah to her car. Ma'am, he said. I wanted to thank you. Not just for your service, though that would be enough. But for showing us what right looks like. That day over Kansas when we discovered who you were, it reminded me that true professionals don't advertise their capabilities. They just perform when it matters. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. Major, you already knew that. You proved it by conducting that intercept exactly the way it needed to be done, regardless of who was aboard. That's the standard. Not cutting corners. Not getting complacent. Treating every mission with the seriousness it deserves. Keep that mindset. Pass it to the next generation. And this community will stay strong. She got into her car. But before driving away, she rolled down the window one last time. And Major, you were lucky to fly with professionals like Captain Chen that day. Keep setting that example. It matters more than you know. Morrison stood in the parking lot as her car disappeared into the distance. He felt the weight of what she'd said. It wasn't about individual glory or recognition. It was about maintaining standards. About being part of something larger than yourself. About ensuring the next generation inherited an institution built on excellence rather than ego. Back in her quiet Colorado town, Sarah settled back into retirement with renewed appreciation for both her past and her present. She still flew her small Cessna over mountain ranges. Still felt that perfect freedom that came with altitude and solitude. But now, occasionally, young pilots would reach out seeking mentorship. She found herself saying yes more often than she'd expected. Not formal relationships. Just conversations over coffee. Advice offered when asked. The kind of quiet guidance that didn't require ceremony but could make all the difference to someone navigating the early stages of a challenging career. The incident aboard Flight 227 had pulled her briefly back into the spotlight she'd never sought. But it had also reminded her why she'd loved her service. Not the combat victories or the command positions or the decorations, though those had their place. What she'd loved was being part of a community dedicated to mastering difficult skills and employing them with precision and judgment. She'd loved the intellectual challenge of tactical problems. The physical thrill of pushing an aircraft to its limits. And the deep satisfaction of knowing her work mattered. One evening, months after the emergency landing, she received an unexpected package. Inside was a photograph professionally framed. The grainy image of two F-22 Raptors in formation with a Boeing 757, captured by a passenger's phone from inside the airliner. Attached was a note in neat handwriting: "Colonel Mitchell, we had this framed for you as a reminder that legends sometimes fly in middle seats. Your example continues to inspire everyone in the 442nd. Respectfully, Razor and Viper." Sarah hung the photograph in her study where it joined other mementos from her career. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded of that strange day when her two worlds had collided. The quiet anonymity she preferred and the professional identity she'd built over decades of service. The image captured something essential about who she was and who she'd always been. Someone content to do extraordinary things without demanding extraordinary recognition. Someone who measured success not by public acclaim but by the quiet knowledge of work well done and standards upheld. The simple woman from Seat 23B had taught the world an important lesson that day over Kansas. Excellence doesn't require recognition. Professionalism transcends circumstances. The most extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, content to let their actions speak while they remain silent. And perhaps most importantly, the measure of a person lies not in how they demand respect, but in how they earn it through consistent, undeniable competence and character.